So here is some figures that he provides. A figure, the legend down here, Sienese debt and grain price indices, 16th and 17th centuries. This is from Siena, which is an area in central Italy, where, courtesy of the Catholic Church, one can go back and reconstruct very, very detailed records of births and deaths, and you can track the rate of deaths over time, and then chart that against prices of grain, and therefore of food. And the point he's trying to draw is that, at least for some of these time periods, you can in fact see some kind of relationship in which it appears that prices, the solid line, move in some kind of correlated way with deaths. And it's sometimes the deaths seem to precede the price increases, as in the upper left in 15, 53, 54, 55. Other times it seems that the prices precede the deaths. So it's a little hard to say exactly. Did prices go up? And we can imagine a mechanism here in which the price of food goes up, and certain people find themselves less able to afford food. They buy less food, and that might expose the vulnerable parts of those populations, maybe the elderly or people who are sick or very young children. That might weaken their immune systems, for example, and cause them to become susceptible at a higher rate to various kinds of diseases, and that might kill a certain number of them. On the other hand, it's not quite clear what to make of a situation in which it appears that the deaths precede the rise in prices. And there are a lot of different causal pathways here to imagine, right? You have to think about what caused the prices to go up. And in most of these graphs, we're interested in the price relative to wages. So you have to ask, well, the price of grain might have gone up, but if wages also went up, then it wouldn't constitute a real increase in the price of food and might not have this effect. So then we need to think about larger economic activity, that kind of thing. In these cases, we're also concerned to consider the possibility of the plague or other epidemic diseases that swept through and killed a lot of people and may or may not have had anything to do with the price of food at that point in time, right? So these are, again, examples over short time periods in a limited area where there does appear to be some kind of empirical relationship between deaths and the price of food. But it's hard to know exactly how to interpret those cases. Whoops. Here is, I'm sorry, did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Wouldn't death lower the population and then make the price go down, though, because it's cheaper for people to be able to eat because there's more available to them?
Okay, yes, good point. And actually, I think we're going to get to that here. Presumably, if a lot of people die, then there are fewer people to feed. And that means that the supply of food becomes more adequate even in the absence of an increase in food production, right? So there is some kind of interaction here that where these cycles might dampen each other, right? And in fact, you might look at some of these and imagine that as people died in 1692 to 1694, it made food relatively more available, and that might have contributed to the decline in the rate of increase of prices for food, and also then in turn the decline in deaths. So looked at over larger scales, temporal and spatial, here we're looking at Europe as a whole from 1200 to 18 or 1850, population and grain prices, population on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and we see that they seem to move, these are on indexes, of course, so that we can compare them. They seem to move together between 1200 and 1500, then they, something weird goes on there, and then at the end, they move together, but they're both moving up at the same time. Now, if the sort of Malthusian framework is going to hold up, we have to imagine that population increases lead to price increases, which then dampen population growth, right? So some kind of modulation of up and down might make sense, but a combined, uniform, sustained increase or decrease does not make sense. Yeah? Okay. Another consideration, population can affect the labor supply, which can affect the number of people available to harvest the food, and therefore affect the supply of food. That is also a consideration. In the case of, the Black Plague in Europe is the classic major sort of case study for thinking about these things. And in that case, you saw a collapse in the population on the order of 30%. However, as far as historians have been able to reconstruct, before that happened, the sort of agricultural production system of Europe was sort of maxed out, and a lot of suboptimal land or subprime land was in production. And when population declined and food demand declined, a lot of that land went out of production. And so you had a smaller number of people chasing a smaller amount of food concentrated on more productive land, which enabled greater agricultural production per capita, even in the absence of a larger supply of labor to harvest. Does that answer your question or not quite?
Yeah, I thought maybe it was one different book.
Well, no, you may not have misread it. You may go back and look at it again and bring it up again if you want. Labor prices go up, and therefore grain prices go up? Right, except that the wages are only a portion of the cost of the production. Yeah, we should talk further about it. Okay. Other questions? Breaking this down further and looking at asking exactly what are the effects over time. What are the relations on the one hand between wages and fertility, which is one way of affecting population, and on the other hand, wages and life expectancy, which is the other way to affect population, or that population might express itself, population change. This allows us to sort of tease this out and ask, okay, well, if there's a relationship between wages and population, is it that wages affect how many children get born, or is it that wages affect how long people live after they're born? And here we see that the relationship is a great deal tighter for fertility than it is for mortality, right? You see situations, so the children for women and life expectancy are the dark lines, real wages are the dotted lines. You can see that in the upper graph, you can have a situation in which prices of food go down significantly and the life expectancy goes down. There are other instances in which they are moving opposite to each other. And Libby-Bocci's general conclusion here is that if we're going to think about wages and their effect on population, we should actually not focus our attention on the effect of wages on mortality, notwithstanding those data from Siena that we graphed earlier. It would appear that, in fact, the consideration that matters is how wages affect fertility, and you can see a general relationship. An increase in wages is likely to increase the number of children born to the average woman. Questions about that? All right, the big question, as we make this transition from Chapter 3 to Chapter 4, and in many ways as we transition from Malthus to Marx, is what happened in the 19th century. There appears to be something different going on beginning in the 19th century, and it's captured here in this figure charting population and real wages in England between 1550 and 1850. You see that up until about 1800, the two trends seem to work in opposite directions and counterbalance each other. There seems to be some kind of negative feedback. If you see rising real wages, as occurs through this stretch of time, it appears that population increases. Well, hold on, let me back up here. As real wages decline, we see an increase in population that goes up until, at some point, presumably, real wages have to increase. Why would that be? This is not, for some reason, my own explanation here is not satisfying me right now. Help me out. Interpret this graph for me. You got to do some work. Yeah. I'm sorry? There'd be a lag before you saw an increase in fertility? I think actually the relationship that we're supposed to be imagining here is one in which an increase in population eventually creates an oversupply of labor, or at least a growth in the supply of labor, which means that wages come down. Right? More labor means lower wages if the amount of jobs, the number of jobs remains constant. Conversely, if population,
Seems like the same thing applies to grain.
yes. If we imagine, yeah,
Is immigration a factor around between 1650 and 1700?
is immigration a factor between 1650 and 1700?
An exodus of labor to colonies.
Good question. I don't think it was a huge factor in the overall population of Europe. I mean, or I'm sorry, England. You're right, it's England. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Okay, why would you put it in psychology rather than just in the realm of the supply of jobs? I mean, not to dispute the relationship you're describing, but just that it's not clear to me that it would have to reside at the level of what people expect. It could simply be the level of what people find, what people encounter. If we, yeah. Yeah, we're trying to interpret this graph, and the question is, if the two seem to move in opposite directions up to here, and then they cross paths, and they start to diverge the other direction, but then they collect, they narrow again, and then they cross paths and they narrow again, and then suddenly they actually start moving in the same direction rather than the opposite direction. Okay, something happens here in terms of the dynamics of the production system as a whole. And that's exactly the point that someone like Marx is going to make, right? And in fact, that is more or less the point that Livy-Bacci makes as well. That whereas previously there was some kind of coupled relationship, or appears to be a coupled relationship empirically, between population and real wages. Actually, that's the answer to your question. This is real wages. So whatever the changes in the price of grain happen to have been, they are factored into this graph. It's not to say that your point is incorrect, but simply that this graph is sort of correcting for that. Okay? Yeah.
But it's also related to the fact that if you're making less wages on a whole, you want postpone getting married, whereas you have children.
Right. That's something that we're going to get to later on in this lecture, actually. The question of exactly what affects decisions about fertility and the switch from age at marriage as a dominating aspect of that to other factors. So let's just stop and summarize this. The idea here is that there was a relationship, and let's interpret it this way. A growing population eventually will cause a decline in wages. The decline in wages will dampen the growth in population, which eventually will mean a slowdown in the supply of labor, which will eventually bring wages back up. That's a nice, simplified way of interpreting this relationship. And the point is that even if you accept it, for the period up to about 1775 or 1800, it no longer seems supported by these data after that point in time. Something changes in the 19th century. Okay? So Livy-Bacci concludes the Malthusian model applies particularly to agricultural economies, the growth of which is limited by the availability of land, and to poor populations which spend a good part of their incomes acquiring food. Until the time of Malthus and the Industrial Revolution, almost all the countries of the world fit into these categories. Many poor countries still do today. However, Malthus's forceful logic becomes less compelling when dealing with industrial processes which are subject to continual technological innovation and employ resources which are for the most part renewable or replaceable. Now we can dispute the details of this, but in many ways, this continual technological innovation and the employment of resources, whether we are happy with renewable or replaceable, it's an increasing use of resources, is quite similar to Marx's arguments about the changing organic composition of capital, right? Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. Okay. Let's pick up again here. Another sort of concluding remark from Livy Bacci. Beginning of the 19th century, European population grew in a climate of declining prices and increasing wages. The difficult balance between population and land was broken as economic and demographic growth became not competing but complementary forces. So this is his way of glossing the conclusion that we just reached before the break, that the difficult balance between population and land was broken. So now we want to talk about what's happened since then, or how we understand this decoupled system in which you do not see some kind of feedback relationship between population growth and economic growth. And this has come to be called the demographic transition. In many ways, this is the central concept of modern demography, at least at a macro scale. What is it? Anybody? What is the demographic transition? Yeah. Okay, it's a transition in which you go from a situation of short life expectancy and high fertility, so high fertility and high mortality, both, to a situation of long life expectancy, low mortality, and low fertility. Yeah. Okay. It's a series of steps. There's some important wrinkles that aren't yet in place in what I just said. Okay, what are some of these steps in between? What happens first? If you start in a situation of high mortality and high fertility, what happens next? Which comes down first, mortality or fertility? This is like the simplest question. If you've done the reading, you know the answer. Yes. Mortality comes down first. So you start seeing longer life expectancy. Eventually, you also see declining fertility. In between, what are you going to have? A higher rate of population growth. If mortality comes down first and fertility remains what it was, you're going to see population growth. And exactly how quickly the decline in fertility follows on the decline in mortality will have a huge impact on what the overall population growth is by the time you get to the stage where they both come down, right? Come out the other end, so to speak. And the point was raised down here a moment ago that it's possible that we should start thinking about a situation in which fertility gets so low that population growth actually becomes negative, even though mortality is also very low. And this is something that is found in some parts of Europe right now, for example. There are actually populations where the fertility rate is below replacement. Yeah.
I feel like this is a linear kind of thing. I don't know, I was linear of it. I feel like it's like focused on the nation state as a unit, which is scarce.
Okay.
When the economy is looking at a global scale, you can't make lines like that.
Okay. Some interesting points raised here. First, he's uncomfortable with linearity. Anybody else uncomfortable with linearity? Sorry, I'm not slighting the remark at all. Actually, I'm kind of uncomfortable with linearity. But the point he raises is there are a lot of assumptions built into the theory of the demographic transition. One of them, as he points out, is that it tends to take the world as composed of units that are nation states, and it tends to look at population patterns at that using that unit, right? And it's an open question how things might look differently if you didn't look at things in terms of nation states and instead looked at, say, the global